There's a lot of very vibrant essays about the horror of going to church in general these days, because so much of the liturgy is filled with noise. Because there's so much, at one end, guitars, hand clapping, inspirational speeches, and general busyness. Even in a more traditional sacramental church, the pace at which the liturgy is delivered is often incompatible with any sort of appreciation of silence. I found that really rich because it's really helped me. Maggie's perspective is that the words in liturgy always emerge from silence and return to silence. And I repeat that phrase quite a lot, partly to remind myself to slow the hell down. But that perspective of understanding that the core of the liturgical experience is silence and beholding the immanent presence of God in the Eucharist. And that it works insofar as you honour that, and the words and the sound is there to point out the silence almost. So you draw the mind out of silence into word so that one can return it from word into silence. And it's a sort of a gentle easing of the mind into, well, bluntly, the peace that occurs during communion, really. From the peace greeting to the end of the Eucharist is really the point of the whole thing. But it's hard for us to kind of just sort of walk into a room and go clunk and appreciate it. So I think the part of the sort of dramatic function of the Eucharist is to ease the human mind into that experience. God is Mystery and the Primacy of the Natural World. She writes really beautiful stuff about ecological stuff and the sort of spiritual role of being in nature and how important that is. So to get across by what she means when she says beholding, I was just flipping through Tumblr this week and I just ran across this picture. Part of the reputation I try to cultivate at a conclave talk is art porn, just in general. I'm kind of notorious for it. I don't have anything to say here. I just wanted to show you this pretty painting. Here's the thing. This isn't a painting, but I think it is a rather pretty picture. I think that's the Grand Canyon. Which is the counterintuitive, it's the counterintuitive invitation of contemplation. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to do. If you've ever tried to meditate, you know it's very hard to do, right? But that's the invitation. One of the big distinctions that she makes that I think is really critical, when we talk about spirituality, a lot of the time people are describing certain kinds of experiences that they've had. If you read the accounts of mystics, they're talking about mystical visions a lot of the time. Whenever I've taught centering prayer, we always do the first 20-minute practice of centering prayer, and then I say, so how did you go, right? And I'm asking, how did you go with the practice of letting go of your thoughts? And instead, usually what I get is about half the people in the room saying, I had this amazing feeling of light in my body, and then I felt I was transported to the ninth heaven, and then there was an angel, and this goes on for some time. And there's a long narrative of experience, which I'm sure was very lovely, but it's really not the point. Beholding is a different thing from experiencing. From Maggie's point of view, when she says behold, she's indicating witnessing awareness without that awareness getting caught up with being involved in what's going on, which is the posture that you're trying to, I love this because it's the posture that you're trying to cultivate in centering. It's that letting go of whatever's going on and simply allowing the mind to relax into open awareness. Interestingly, so one of the places where Maggie gets sort of polemically furious is that the word behold was really all the way through the King James Version of the Bible. Everyone's constantly beholding everything. Behold! It's constantly saying. And it's got washed out of most of the modern translations in favour of look or see, which doesn't mean the same thing, right? That they're experience words, they're not non-experience words. Behold's used in the King James Version of the Bible to translate hine in Hebrew and ido in Greek, both of which mean roughly the same kind of thing. It's about beholding something which from a non-experiential stance. This is Maggie's, okay, so I can't defend the translation, I'm just repeating what she's telling me, okay? But I would encourage everyone who has a better scholarly eye than I do to test some of these hypotheses and come back and we'll argue about it. So Maggie is, Andrew Raquel from Auckland sent me a blog post she did a couple of weeks ago around Easter. And his email said, even when she's being complimentary, she's still furious. She has a sort of incandescence in the way she writes. It's so full of rage so much of the time. But it's the kind of anger that indicates a concern, often with justice. It's the anger that's roused when people are done badly by an institution. The kind of anger that's roused when you see an ecological disaster that's the result of human greed and incompetence. It's the kind of anger that you get from just really wanting to do the thing that you most passionately feel that God is calling you to do, and the people you expect to support you are letting you down in the commission of that. That's what comes back again and again. It's a kind of a justice rage, if you want to call it that. And I think most of us are familiar with that feeling. Oh, look, this is one of those dualistic non-duality presentations that I don't know if I've really got the time or patience to deliver, so I won't, but I can give you this stuff later. This is someone's gone through the whole of Maggie Ross's blog and kind of, this is the polemic division, really. She's saying right over left. And I could go through that one by one, but let's not. I think that's probably enough. Maggie Ross, we okay? Everyone's cool? Beholding, it's all good? Contemplative core Christian experience? Okay. Sure, is there anything you want to?
No, I'm just reading.
Dink. Likes of Vatican II, not so keen on a council of Trent around. Recently she's been writing quite a lot of interesting stuff that I find kind of fascinating because I really don't have any of the background to really to parse it properly, about the deep structures in the human brain and the way some of these differences between the way a certain level of mind grasps at experience and the way a deeper level of mind is able to hold phenomena and open awareness without getting involved in experience, and the way that's paralleled by some structures deeper in the brain that's starting to come out in neurology recently. I've had a few friends kind of throwing me this stuff from different directions. So it's not the left-right brain distinction, it's a level of brain structure distinction. All right. So, Cynthia Bourgeois, Mary Colo, Maggie Ross. So Maggie Ross has a blog. She has a brain. In addition to her brain, she also has a blog that's called Raven Wilderness. And I commend it to you highly. She posts something about once a week or once every couple of weeks or whatever, and it's always good. It's always really interesting. She's been posting a series called How the Contemplative Life Died, which is a sort of biographical sketch of her time in a convent. So, all right. So the third of my 5 women, and this will take a little bit longer, is this is my favourite insane pixie picture of Bernadette Roberts. Yeah. Who can also seem quite cranky in what she writes. Now, you may be familiar with Bernadette if you're on the Johannite clergy list, because about 6 months or so ago, I posted something that Bernadette had written and said, this seems to be expressing a kind of Johannite point of view, I think. And I got the smack down. And I got the smack down not because of what she was saying in content terms, but in how she was saying it. She was go ahead.
Cranky.
Yeah, she's very cranky, right? Cranky specific, and she was basically saying, so it's a forward to, she's just published, or she's in the process of publishing a book called The Real Christ. Great title, right? As opposed to The Unreal Christ, which is what you people have been talking about for the last 1,000 years. There's a similarity, actually. There's a well, yeah. I kind of get it, actually, having read some of the book now, I guess. But there's a sense with all of these women. I said innovative theology right at the beginning, but the interesting thing is this is when you think of innovative anything, right? You're often thinking about someone creating something entirely new out of whole cloth. That's brings a new kind of, like an iPad or something, which wasn't that new actually. What's a better example? I don't know.
3D laser printer.
Thank you. Brilliant. Something which has never existed before. It's a disruptive innovation. It's a completely new thing. It's totally original and inventive. Each of these 5 women is producing innovative theology, but they're doing it in a way which is the way you have to do theology, which is to kind of reach back through the tradition to earlier points of bearing. So it winds up being polemic because it's often a polemic against the last few centuries of theology, particularly Western theology, and it pulls it off by reaching around Western theology to places like the Syriac Fathers, which is material that's only begun to become available, or Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or to the Nation Mahdi Library, and to use those as points to kind of get a deeper bearing on where the tradition might have grown from, and to be able to kind of locate places where it might have taken turns that, from our perspective now, may have turned out to be unfortunate, and that we might be better served by going back earlier. So Bernadette and Maggie particularly spend a lot of time talking about the patristics and trying to sort of ground what they're saying in the view of theology that you get from the church fathers in the sort of, where am I now, sort of 300s through to the sort of 700s, I guess. Don't know if that's too long. Somewhere around that sort of time. Looking at people who presumably know this better than me.
Well, Weston East defines the church fathers kind of differently from the 3rd century clear up to the 7th, right?
Mm-hmm. About that. Okay. So there's 3 key things that Bernadette's notable for. First, to kind of ground this, because so much of her work is about her personal journey. You kind of need to know a little bit about her personal journey, so I'll just a bit more depth on that than I've done for anybody else. You occasionally encounter people who are sometimes referred to as spiritually gifted or contemplatively gifted, who have remarkable experiences that the rest of us struggle for decades for, magically very early in life. So Bernadette had a range of spiritual revelation experiences when she was quite little. She experienced pretty much the exact marks of what John of the Cross describes as divine union as a teenager, rather than in her 30s or 40s, which is when a lot of people encounter it. Recognising this was probably an important thing, she decided to become a nun, because that's what you do, right? That didn't go so well, because trying to explain to the novice mistress what her experiences were like, the novice mistress sort of decided she was probably possessed by Satan, and needed to get exorcised or banned or something. It was kind of an unfortunate experience. The novice mistress notoriously asked her, what's your prayer like, expecting her to say something like, I say Hail Marys or whatever. And she said, well, nothing, I'm just there, at like 17. And the novice mistress goes, oh, no, that's terribly wrong. And we must fill your mind up with virtuous things. And then it's going, oh, this isn't going to go well. So at some point she left the convent, I think by a mutually agreed exit from the community, raised a family, had kids, she's a grandmother now. At some point in midlife, she experienced an event that she describes as the no-self event. And I'll talk a lot more about that in a sec. She tried to do is to try to make sense of what was going on, because it didn't seem to map to what she was reading, what she'd read in the literature. So she spent a long time with John of the Cross and tried to map what had happened to her in her life to what John of the Cross described as the spiritual journey. And she reached a point in John of the Cross that matched the event that she'd experienced as a teenager, and then John of the Cross kind of taps out, and there's nothing, he didn't write anything further past that point. But what seemed to be happening to her seemed to continue past that point. She spent a long time trying to get other people to tell her, other people that might have written about it, and there didn't seem to be any other people that had written about it. So kind of reluctantly, at some point, she started to write books. Because enough people kind of said, okay, well, it's not like this has never happened to anyone else, but nobody else seems to have really written it down. So it's probably worth writing it down. At the very least, you'll get other people to give you feedback on what seems to have happened to you, but perhaps you'll be sharing something that would be of value to other people as well. So she did. She wrote a very widely read book called The Path to No Self, which describes kind of step by step what that transition seemed like. And that's the first phase of her writing, which is talking about, this is interesting, right? Because an awful lot of what you read in the contemplative literature implies that the end of the contemplative journey is divine union. And in Catholic contemplative literature particularly, in Teresa, in John, in Bernard of Clairvaux, that's depicted as a point where the self and God become so close as to seem indistinguishable, but the distinction between them never entirely collapses. Bernard's quite clear on this. It seems to never entirely collapse. Perhaps that doesn't happen until after death. think Bernard writes. And in a sort of official Catholic contemplative literature, that's it. It never gets closer than that. There's no separation between self and God, but there's always a subtle distinction between self and God. It's a union of two, it's never a one. So the Path to No Self talks about the collapse of that distinction, the end of which is not a one, interestingly. Then her second phase of what she was writing was to talk about what the nature of self might have been. She kind of says, you can't really know what a self is until you don't seem to have one anymore, and then by reflecting on what seems to have happened, you can work out what you've just lost. So she figures that's probably a book worth writing. And then the last phase of her work, most recently, over the last sort of 5 years, is to talk about, from her perspective, what is the nature of Christ. And which is what she documents in this book, The Real Christ. And what she's documenting really is patristic theology on Christology, actually. But to kind of do it from her perspective at the end of this journey, towards the end of this journey. Frowny Patriarch, pausing. Thinking? Okay, good. All right. So the key things in terms of understanding what Bernadette's on about is to understand the distinction between ego and self. Now, very often when we, in casual talk about the spiritual journey, we're mostly talking about the loss of ego, or the collapse of ego, or the transparency of ego, or the opening of ego, or whatever. And an awful lot of spiritual literature depicts that as the culmination of the spiritual journey. There's deeper stuff. Meister Eckhart actually goes beyond this point. Zen literature, if you're reading it carefully, goes beyond this point, although some bits ambiguous. Tibetan Buddhism goes beyond this point, but it's not, in most mainstream spiritual literature, stops at the ego. So let's just dive into a little bit what Bernadette's pointing to when she talks about the distinction between ego and self, because both these words are used in lots of ways, right? So a Freudian sense of what ego means is quite different from what other people mean when they talk about ego. So I'm going to do this through two kind of longish quotes. Sorry, Ben, I'll read them out. Okay. So ego, in terms of our experience of ourselves, ego is the interior movement we experience, so it's characterized by experience. And recall Maggie's talk about experience. Ego is the interior movement we experience when we do not get what we want. It is also the experience of near uncontainable highs when we do get what we want. Okay, so it's all about wanting and desire and the satisfaction or thwarting of wanting and desire. The ego is the experience of self-will, a will turned solely on itself that seeks its own fulfillment and benefit. Thus, the ego is a particular self-energy or power that can go either way, negatively toward what is not good for self, or positively toward what is good for self. If we believe that the divine is our highest good, then the ego goes in pursuit of the divine, and this pursuit is the ego's true, proper developmental direction. The ego is therefore basically good. It's only bad when it goes against its own highest good. And that's a pretty patristic point of view. That's not a particularly controversial thing to say. When the Eastern Fathers talk about sin, they're usually talking about the ego closed on itself, a self-referring move. When desire is pointed in the right direction towards God, it draws the soul towards God, and that's the appropriate thing to do. Self is at a sort of deeper level of, the self is sort of consciousness itself, really. So I'm quoting Rick Williams here, who wrote the foreword to What is Self, not Bernadette, because he puts it more pithily than Bernadette herself does. So I've just used his quote because it's easier to get it. So self is the mind bending on itself to know, not to want, but to know, and see itself, which he calls reflection. It's reflexive, so hence reflection. The energy that runs the reflexive mind, so there's two things present here. There's energy and there's the reflection itself. So the energy that runs the reflexive mind, however, is vital to its reflexive movement. Thus the two together constitute the whole of the self, or the whole of consciousness. Together they give rise to the feeling of life, energy, and being, more especially the sense of being an individual entity. Self, then, is consciousness, self-awareness, and responsible for the way we experience all things, whether of the relative world or the divine. And depending on her maturity, she identifies either ego or God as the center of the self structure. I'm going to walk through that in a bit more depth in a sec. Now, self okay, just to review, is the feeling of life, energy, and being. Now, if you're committed to this whole spiritual journey thing, and you buy Bernadette's contention that the end of self is the culmination of the spiritual journey, then she's literally talking about the end of the feeling of life, energy, and being. Unsurprisingly, when someone relates that experience, it doesn't sound particularly fun or cool. It's kind of horrible. It's a lot like dying. I'm not going to read any of Bernadette's book, The Path to No Self, is quite readable. It's a bit dry. Father Thomas Keating, I think, read it and said, yes, it's very clear. How lovely it would have been had she been a poet. However, had she been a poet, it wouldn't probably be as clear. Okay, so the human spiritual journey in Bernadette's world is characterised by the kind of road that's described by John of the Cross, so which is the up to the point of the loss of ego, and then a point past that, which Bernadette's devoted herself to trying to document, from the loss of ego to the end of self. That's quite hard to describe, so I've made an animated picture. Okay. I spent at least 30 minutes on this, so I hope you appreciate it. All right, so in the beginning, before we begin the path in any intensive sense, we've got a sense of, you have a sense of yourself, and if you're a religious person, you have a sense of God, and you imagine God. Maybe you have experiences maybe of feeling God out there, or you might understand God to be outside yourself, and that's kind of where you direct devotional attention. So folks who haven't really begun the contemplative journey imagine themselves directing their prayer to God, who's somewhere outside. So the first thing that happens when you begin the spiritual journey is you start to notice that there's two sort of aspects to the self, and that's kind of interesting. So there's this core part, which is this part of you that has self-will, but there seems to be more to you than just that ego part. This is the ego part, this blue part here. You can feel that. It's a bit confusing. You kind of might imagine that the spiritual journey is characterised by kind of getting out of that and making this the place where you live. You might have the experience in meditation of kind of dropping from this part to this part and kind of feeling, okay, that's what I've got to do. I'm going to spend more time down here. I've got to kill this, got to get rid of it. It's kind of an evil thing, got to pop it like a balloon. That's what's going to happen, right? These are all misguided ideas, but it's often how it feels. There's this sort of core, and then you have these occasional pop moments of feeling like you're outside the core, and that's pretty much how it's constituted. Okay, so then the next thing that often happens, so this not necessarily in this order, is that you go from feeling that God is outside to feeling that God is inside, and beginning to have the sense of God as indwelling the person, sometimes at the core of the ego. So what then, all things being equal, happen is that initially, as the process of contemplative prayer continues, sometimes those feelings of God at the core begin to disappear. You still have an ego. God seems to have dropped out, and this is what contemplative literature refers to as spiritual dryness. So the experience of God in the centre seems to disappear, and it's replaced by a dark hole. This is one of those moments in the spiritual journey which is rarely pleasant. There's a kind of a Saint Teresa of Calcutta writes about this in her spiritual diary has been published recently, and her early contemplative life was characterised by a lot of sort of luminous experiences of Christ, and there's a point where that kind of just goes paff and disappears, and she's devastated because for her that experience of God in her centre is what it's about. And it goes for a long time, like 15 years, where she's kind of feels like she's stuck here. And her spiritual director doesn't know what to do, and so no one really gives her any particularly good advice, and so she just stays here for quite a long time, and it's quite awful. Then what happens after that is that if you allow that experience, and you kind of don't fight it, and don't try to get God back, because there's something wrong with God having disappeared, if you understand that this is a natural part of the spiritual process, then you cease experiencing that hole in the centre as darkness and come to understand it as light, which is the key thing. John of the Cross writes really beautifully about this. This is the experience he describes as the living flame of love, which is a familiar image for Johannite, I think. So the way Bernadette writes, what happens, and she's sort of, tag teaming with John of the Cross through a lot of this. She's leaning on his descriptions of the path and also on her own experiences. She's narrating this. What slowly starts to happen is that divine core, that light, which is no longer characterized as experiential really, it's felt but not felt, it's beheld in Maggie's terms, rather than, it's not an experience of angels or God saying anything, it's just this dazzling dark, as some contemplatives have called it. That begins to kind of burn through the ego and begins to become the core of the being. So the ego is transcended not really by being popped, not by being killed. The way Bernadette likes to phrase it is to use John of the Cross's image that it's burned through by the divine flame. So the ego is kind of eaten up from within and replaced so that the self... So counterpoint this with our original picture, which had the self with the ego in the centre. The ego is kind of burnt through by the sacred flame, and now there's the self with God at the centre. Now that's divine union. That's pretty much it. That sort of last few stages is the passage of divine union. Okay, so that's where the classic literature kind of stops. This is and Bernadette says, from Bernadette's point of view, this is spiritual adulthood, right? So this is where we all ought to, this is the regular life of a Christian, or it ought to be. And part of the reason she's writing this stuff is to kind of say, there's an awful lot of people that get here. This is not that drastically unusual, right? It's not an unreasonable thing to aspire to in spiritual life. It's not like the vastest height of contemplative anything that you might hope to get to in life. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to devote yourself to achieving, or, well, not that you're really achieving it by the time you're at this point, right? Because the achievement thing is all wrapped up with the ego thing, but get the ego on the job and get amongst it, because that's a perfectly reasonable thing to go for. The unfortunate thing I think about contemplative literature in the last few hundred years is characterising this as something that's only achieved by the highest of saints and doctors of the church, and that ordinary people should just content themselves with doing the rosary and just shut up. Go to mass, do the rosary, don't get tickets on yourself. You're not Saint Teresa, kids. Okay, so the controversial thing Bernadette proposes is that there are stages beyond this. So the way she depicts it is that the divine flame at this point has burned through and consumed the ego. So the self
made a tasty donut.
And made a tasty, tasty donut. It is close to dinner time, I grant you. The way she describes this phase of the spiritual journey is actually quite beautiful, because this is the kind of, when you see people like, so you might think of like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or Teresa of Calcutta, you see people who seem to operate really without any sense of ego. They're throwing themselves into whatever it is they feel they've been given to do without any apparent concern for themselves or their health or anything. It's this kind of driven, lit up from within. When we talk about saints, this is usually the people we're thinking of. These are people that are driven to service. And that's one of the ways Bernadette characterises it, is this drive to service. With no self-reflection in it, really. There's no ego that's trying to get what you want. There's the sense of God within kind of driving you to do what you're given to do. So it sounds like quite a beautiful phase. There's a lot of passion and forward motion in it. It's quite joyful. So, the service part is really important. This is kind of, she calls it the return to the marketplace. So that early phase, might be hastened by being in a monastery, but then when you get to this phase, you kind of really want to, and you see this in people like Bernard of Clairvaux, right, who have a contemplative phase early in life and then get really hyperactive. Hildegard of Bingen, another great example of a gifted contemplative who's really active in the world. Now, one way of looking at it might be that person is kind of turning their back on the contemplative vocation. They've gone from being Mary to being Martha or something. Why are they so busy with papal politics now? What's going on? Bernadette's point of view is that one, you're driven to do that. Two, the action in the world starts to accomplish the next move, which you don't necessarily even notice, but that the flame doesn't stop with consuming the ego. The flame continues and begins to consume that sense of self, so that it's kind of hollowed out from within by this sense of the divine presence, which gets exciting and luminous. Do you want to go? Okay, I know. And the more you express God's love in the world, the more the flame consumes that sense, that necessity for self-reflection, and that